Hey, what's going on, guys? OJ back with another video. Today, we're here to talk about the UFC's most hated fighters. And when I mean the UFC's most hated fighters, I'm not talking about the guys that us fans despise. I'm talking about the fighters the UFC show blatant disdain towards, especially by the company's president, Dana White. We're going to talk about the fighters the UFC despise the most, explain why the UFC hates them, assess whether or not that reason is justified, and also my personal feelings on the fighter. So, without wasting any more time, let's jump straight into the video. Our first fighter is going to be Tagir Ulanbekov. Now, normally when you hear this elite level Dagestani from Habib and Islam's training camps, you would think Ulanbekov would get some sort of favors from the UFC. Oh, but no, the UFC truly disdained this guy. Despite being ranked top 15 in the flyweight division, this guy is constantly fighting below the rankings or people outside of the rankings because the UFC don't want this guy near the UFC belt. Other than his loss to Tim Elliott, where Elliott was cheating his ass off the entire fight, Tagir has looked very good in all of his fights. But honestly, I kind of get it from the UFC because he pulls out of a lot of fights. Tagir Ulanbekov has pulled out of 8 UFC fights throughout his career, and that's more than the actual number of fights this guy actually competes. I do feel like Tagir needs some form of jump up in the rankings because the guy's good. Every single opponent the UFC have put to get against Tagir so far, he has either beat dominantly or finished them in like the second round. I reckon Tagir is like top 6 to 10 level as of right now, and the fact that he isn't is kind of strange. But this is one of the few cases where I fully understand why the UFC do not like this guy whatsoever. Because Ulanbekov is always pulling out of fights due to either injury or just missing weight. And as a matchmaker, I would definitely not give this guy any favors, seeing as how half the time he can't even be trusted to just show up and fight. Up next, we have Grant Dawson. This guy could win his next 5 fights in the division, and he would still not be close to being in the top 5 conversations. Other than Bobby Green, dude has had nothing but impressive victories. He mauled Damir Ismagulov. He submitted Jared Gordon in their fight. He beat the shit out of Carlos Diego Ferreira. These are extremely solid wins. Am I saying Grant Dawson is this world beater in the lightweight division? No. But the fact that his only loss was to Bobby Green, and now he had to win like 3 more fights in a row to get back into the rankings is kind of showing how much the UFC think of this guy. Like, I would pick Grant Dawson to beat Paddy Pimblett. I don't think that's a hot take. Yes, Paddy Pimblett's grappling's amazing, but so is Grant Dawson. And not only that, Grant Dawson has able to show that against competition where their grappling's also really good. I just think that Grant Dawson is the more reserved version of Paddy Pimblett. I think both fighters are roughly the same level in terms of jiu-jitsu, but the difference is Paddy Pimblett knows how to sell a fight and he has a lot of followers on Instagram. I think that's the only reason why Grant Dawson is being mistreated by the UFC a lot. And I understand that, but it is kind of scummy to see the UFC doing that to Grant Dawson in a way. Next, we have Jack Hermanson. The UFC does not like this guy whatsoever. He fights once a year, fraud checks another promising prospect in the middleweight division, and then goes back to hibernation. This is the Jack Hermanson cycle. He also doesn't have a lot of finishing potential. Like when he fraud checks prospects, it's not like he's getting these highlight reel finishes. The guy just sticks his jab at range and calf kicks and will piece you up as the fight progresses. The UFC hate this guy so much, they don't even have him in the official rankings right now. I get it because Hermanson doesn't fight all that often, but I rate Hermanson a lot higher than a lot of the guys in the top 10 to 15 range right now. If Hermanson had a rematch with either Marvin Vettori or Roman Dolidze, I would pick Jack Hermanson to beat either of those guys. I would also pick him to beat Paulo Costa and Rainer de Ritter, who just recently got it added into the top 15. The only two I would say may cook Hermanson are Michel Pereira because he could just finish Hermanson in the first round, and Roman Kopylov because Roman Kopylov is actually good and not a big oaf like the majority of the ranked middleweights in the top 10 to 15 range. I get why the UFC hates Jack Hermanson because he fights once a year, just a project, a promising prospect the UFC is trying to build up. But in a way, that's why I personally love Jack Hermanson. I'm not saying he's this must-see TV guy, but to see this guy like Hermanson, who is skilled, experienced enough to show the difference between an unranked middleweight and a ranked middleweight, is very good in my opinion. And he is one of the best gatekeepers in the sport right now, and that's why I love him. Moving on to the next fighter, we have Movsar Evloev. This guy could beat everyone in the featherweight roster, and he still might not even get a title shot. He already has wins over Diego Lopez, Aljamain Sterling, Arnold Allen, even though I don't agree with the decision, and Dan Ige. This kind of resume at featherweight should normally warrant a title shot. Now, I don't keep it a secret that I do not like Movsar Evloev. He is a pedophile, and all he does is stall out fights at times. But I can also see that the UFC are blatantly showing their disdain towards Movsar Evloev. Diego Lopez, the guy Evloev beat, is fighting for the vacant featherweight belt and not Movsar Evloev. As I start watching Evloev fights more, I start to respect him more as a fighter. The guy can make wrestling look very fun, and that is very hard to do in my opinion. This might come off as a hot take. I think Bob Evloev would beat Diego Lopez in a rematch. I believe that Evloev's style is the perfect antithesis to Lopez's style, which is trying to bulldoze people wherever the fight goes in the first two rounds. I'm not saying Evloev is unbeatable because I do believe Alexander Volkanovski can beat him right now. But what I am saying is I don't think the UFC can hide Movsar Evloev much longer. I understand why the UFC don't like this guy because 8 fights in the UFC and he has 0 finishes, but it's only a matter of time before Evloev gets his title shot because he is rightfully the next title challenger. No matter how much I disdain Movsar Evloev, that is something I 100% concur with Evloev fans in that Movsar Evloev should be challenging for the vacant featherweight belt over Diego Lopez. But then again, I like Diego Lopez style-wise a lot more, so I'm not going to complain too much, but technically, Movsar Evloev should be the next title challenger. Moving on, we have Aljamain Sterling. I think there is a whole documentary of Dana White ripping into Aljamain Sterling for not initially wanting to fight Sean O'Malley in a 3-month turnaround from a 5-round battle between Henry Cejudo. Safe to say, Aljamain Sterling does not get any gracings from Dana White. I think at first when he won the belt off Peter Yan the way he did, I do understand why the UFC hated this guy. But since then, I thought Sterling made good performances given his style. I found his second fight with Peter Yan to be very smart, and this is coming from a Peter Yan fanboy. I even found his fight with Movsar Evloev incredible to watch. Sure, he may have some stinkers like when he fought Calvin Kattar. I don't fault that performance on Aljamain Sterling whatsoever. I think if you give Aljamain Sterling the right matchups like Movsar Evloev again, he is a fun fighter to watch. And I think the hate on Aljamain Sterling was long overdue since he beat Henry Cejudo. Moving on to Merab Dvalishvili. The fact that this guy is still champion of the bantamweight division must be eating at Dana White's very soul right now. Dana White wants to get rid of Merab as the champion by having him make 4-month turnarounds against Umar Nurmagomedov. Merab still won that fight. Now, I do think because of what Merab did at UFC 311, Dana White has opened up to Merab more, but make no mistake, he will literally give every single advantage to Sean O'Malley for their upcoming rematch. I did initially understand the hate for Merab, especially when he fought Jose Aldo. But after what Mario Bautista did to Aldo, safe to say, no one actually gives a shit that Merab beat Aldo the way he did, because at least Merab was able to put together combinations on the feet. But now I believe the UFC and Merab Dvalishvili have a weird relationship. I do believe the UFC still hates Merab, but in a way they finally respect the guy for what he was able to overcome over the last several years in the bantamweight division. And I think that feeling also translates to me as well as a lot of other fans. Up next, we have Bilal Muhammad. If JDM does not beat Bilal Muhammad at UFC 315, I think Dana White is never going back to Canada ever again. Hell, he might even shut down the welterweight division if Bilal Muhammad wins at UFC 315. You know for a fact that if Bilal lost that title shot against Leon Edwards, Bilal would have had to split the Red Sea and fight Tom Aspinall before getting another title shot. Now, to be fair, I did initially get that at first. His fight with Gilbert Burns was painful to watch. His fight with Wonderboy Thompson was painful to watch. His fight with Vicente Luque was painful to watch. Am I talking about painful as in gore? No, I'm talking about painful as in boring as shit. I knew the UFC knew this because the only free fight you can watch of Bilal Muhammad was when he beat Sean Brady, because every other fight, Dana White has done nothing but trash Bilal Muhammad. Hell, the UFC don't even bother to inform their security that Bilal Muhammad is their welterweight champ. The UFC really does not want this guy to be champ much longer. But the way he beat Sean Brady and Leon Edwards was relatively fun for Bilal Muhammad's standards. Even though he has the athleticism of a 50-year-old GFL prospect, he does a very good job of maximizing his talents. He presses forward constantly, overwhelms people with sheer volume and punches and takedowns, and the guy is super strong and smart. I started to respect Bilal Muhammad after his performance against Leon Edwards, but he is normally boring to watch. Let's not get twisted. Up next, we have one of the most notoriously disrespected fighters on the current roster, Mateusz Gamrot. Mateusz Gamrot can defeat the entire lightweight roster before being given a title elimination bout. This guy will never see a title shot in his lifetime because Dana White and the UFC matchmakers despise this man and his fighting style. Mateusz Gamrot was on a four-fight win streak against top 15 to 10 level opponents, and after that, he was still being forced to fight people below the rankings like Dan Hooker. And this is not even mentioning the fact that I thought Mateusz Gamrot won that fight against Dan Hooker. But here we are in 2025, where if you even suggest Mateusz Gamrot fights someone above him in the current rankings, the UFC will do nothing but laugh in your face. Like, remember when this guy was supposed to be the backup fighter for UFC 294? Right as Charles Oliveira pulled out, the UFC had Mateusz Gamrot weigh in as the backup fighter, but then allowed Alexander Volkanovski to challenge Islam Makhachev on short notice instead. This is how much the UFC hates Mateusz Gamrot, and quite frankly, I believe it's unjustified. I do admit that Gamrot can be a boring crotch sniffer at times, but against guys who can wrestle, he is incredibly fun to watch. I think his fights with Benil Dariush and Armin Sarukian were fucking sick. And not only that, he did really well in his last fight against Dan Hooker. It's not like Gamrot just failed 20 takedowns. Gamrot actually struck on the feet with Hooker and was able to find nice shots throughout the fight. I'm not saying that Mateusz Gamrot is everyone's favorite fighter, but give him the right matchups and he can be incredibly fun to watch. But the UFC does not want to make fun matchups for some reason, and will just call fighters boring because they don't all strike like Alex Pereira or something. And quite frankly, that is very annoying. Moving on, we have Magomed Ankalaev. It took this guy 12 fucking wins, 13 if you want to count Jan Blachowicz draw, in order for him to get a title shot. It's insane how he needed 12 or 13 wins in a row in order to get a title shot in the first place. But here is Sean O'Malley literally coming off a loss, getting a title shot before Magomed Ankalaev. Magomed Ankalaev was one of the few fighters I never understood why the UFC truly despised. He is a very good striker who can knock people out. He's from Dagestan. He doesn't really say no to any fights the UFC gives him. I never understood why the UFC despised this man. Am I saying that Ankalaev is must-see TV like Alex Pereira? No, but it's not like Ankalaev is smudging people up against the fence for 5 rounds, which is a common narrative surrounding Ankalaev at this point. And even the Jan Blachowicz fight that was scored to a draw, I thought Ankalaev clearly won that fight 48 to 47. It's not Ankalaev's fault that the judges are retarded as fuck and don't know how to score fights. The only reason I could understand the UFC's disdain towards Ankalaev is because they see him as a legitimate threat to Alex Pereira. I'm not saying Ankalaev will win the upcoming fight for certain, but out of everyone in the light heavyweight division, Ankalaev has the best chance by far. Out of all the Caucasus region fighters the UFC want to blatantly suppress, Ankalaev was one of the few I was truly confused by, because it's not like Ankalaev says no to any matchups. It's not like Ankalaev doesn't get knockouts. It's not like Ankalaev smudges people up against the fence like a Mario Bautista. Ankalaev is a solid fighter. I do think he is retarded at times because he never uses his wrestling effectively. But he is good, and he will fight whoever the UFC give him. And I think that's more than most of the fighters on the current roster. And again, I never understand why the UFC disdain this guy. Next, we have Jose Aldo. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know what kind of problem the UFC has with Jose Aldo, but the UFC is not very fond of Jose Aldo, to say the very least. Dana White supposedly respects legends of the sport, but he has done nothing but disrespect Jose Aldo's name since his return at UFC 301 by giving him low-ranked bantamweights that nobody gives a fuck about. I get that Aldo needed to fight Martinez initially because we don't know where Aldo stacked up at the time. But right after that fight, he was given Mario Bautista and Ayman Zahabi. Two people nobody amongst the fans and fighters give a single flying fuck about. It's actually criminal the way they treat Jose Aldo, and I have zero explanations as to why they do so. Jose Aldo is arguably the greatest featherweight of all time, if not second to Alexander Volkanovski. He then made two separate title runs at bantamweight despite being out of his prime. He's been a champion and undefeated for almost 10 years during his prime. Like, why the fuck is Jose Aldo being disrespected by the UFC like this? Fuck you, Dana White. Fuck you, Hunter Campbell. Fuck you, Sean Shelby. I hope Jose Aldo ruins every single prospect you retards throw at him. Only to realize that maybe we should not give Jose Aldo undefeated prospects and just give him the legend fights that we want. For fuck's sakes, we've been asking Jose Aldo to fight Corey Sandhagen, Davison Figueiredo, Umar Nurmagomedov, Sean O'Malley, a Peter Yan rematch. Any one of those fights would have been better than fucking Mario Bautista and Aben Zahabi. Fuck you, Dana White. Fuck you, Hunter Campbell. And fuck you, Sean Shelby. And finally, we get to the UFC's number one most wanted right now, Bryce Mitchell. Now, I have a theory about Dana White and Bryce Mitchell. I truly do not believe that Dana White hates Bryce Mitchell for what he said about the Holocaust. You watch Dana White's initial statement regarding Bryce Mitchell, he's reading off Holocaust deaths like they're fight statistics off a sheet of paper. The man actually does not care about what Bryce Mitchell said, it is rather about the other people he offended that give orders to Dana White. If you know who Ariel Emanuel is, I think you know what I'm talking about. My point is that if Dana White truly despised what Bryce Mitchell said on live in this podcast, I think he would have immediately cut Bryce Mitchell off the roster, no questions asked. If anything, I would say the UFC loved Bryce Mitchell because now they get to use Bryce Mitchell as the number one heel on the current UFC roster. He's already got a fight booked against a really well known fighter in Jan Silva on the main card of a pay per view nonetheless. Yeah, the company will always say what Bryce Mitchell did was not okay, but when have you ever heard of Dana White giving a shit about insulting a group of people based on religion, race, and sexuality? I truly believe that the UFC, in a way, appreciate what Bryce Mitchell did because now people are paying attention to the sport. All right, that's gonna be it for today's video. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think about all these fighters who are blatantly disrespected by the UFC. Do you think it's justified, or do you think it's bullshit that the UFC hates these fighters for no apparent reason? Let me know in the comments down below. But other than that, make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time. Peace.